The Pacific may be the deepest and quietest ocean on Earth, but right now it is becoming the loudest strategic battlefield in the world. What Beijing thought would be a slow, silent tightening of control over Asia's seas has triggered the exact opposite of what it intended. Instead of intimidating its neighbors into caution, China may have awakened the most dangerous regional counterforce it could have faced. A new defense wall is rising across the Pacific, stretching from the Korean peninsula to southern Japan, built not only with missiles and warships, but with radar networks, AI-driven systems, autonomous drone swarms, hypersonic weapons, and a level of strategic coordination that would have seemed almost impossible just a few years ago. What China hoped would become its zone of dominance is now becoming the very space in which Japan and South Korea are drawing much closer together, arming faster than ever, and preparing for a future neither of them can afford to ignore. Looking at the map from above, the shift is striking. An invisible steel bridge is now beginning to take shape between Seoul and Tokyo, stretching roughly 1,200 kilometers across some of the most contested waters in Asia. Integrated radar systems, missile defense networks, and expanding strike capabilities are starting to align from the Okinawa Islands in southern Japan all the way to the Korean peninsula. These systems do not exist in a vacuum. They are now being shaped around a common concern, and that concern is no longer limited to North Korea alone. China's increasingly aggressive behavior at sea, its rapid naval expansion, and its willingness to impose pressure from the Yellow Sea to the East China Sea have forced two states with deep historical tensions to look in the same direction at the same time. And that changes everything. The crucial point here is that this was never supposed to happen from Beijing's point of view. China's strategy has long relied not only on growing power, but on fragmentation among its rivals. If Tokyo and Seoul remained divided, if mistrust and historical grievances kept them apart, then China could continue expanding influence one pressure point at a time. But the pressure became too obvious, too direct, and too broad. Instead of dividing its strategic environment, Beijing may have unified it. And now, because of that miscalculation, China is facing something it did not want to see: the emergence of a far more integrated and technologically ambitious defense architecture in the Pacific. Japan's response has been especially dramatic. Tokyo has begun deploying systems and doctrines that would have been politically and psychologically unthinkable for much of the post-war era. For a country that spent nearly 80 years defining itself primarily through a defensive military posture, the speed and scale of this shift are extraordinary. The old assumption that Japan would rely only on shield-like defensive systems is now being replaced by something far more complex. That shield is still there, but it is now being paired with a sword. One of the most important examples came in March 2026, when Japan deployed its upgraded domestically produced Type 12 missiles to Camp Kingun in Kumamoto Prefecture and Camp Fuji in Shizuoka Prefecture. The earlier version of the Type 12 had a range of around 200 kilometers. The new version extends that reach to approximately 1,000 kilometers. That is not a technical tweak. That is a strategic transformation. It means that key targets, including major infrastructure and military facilities on China's eastern seaboard, now fall within the reach of Japanese missiles in ways they did not before. It also means that Taiwan, Shanghai, and large stretches of China's maritime approach are now part of a different kind of military equation, one in which Japan is no longer positioned solely as a passive defender waiting to absorb pressure. And the Type 12 is only one layer of what Tokyo is building. The larger architecture now taking shape includes hypersonic glide vehicles capable of maneuvering through the atmosphere at speeds above Mach 5. Traditional ballistic missiles follow a relatively predictable arc. That arc can be tracked, modeled, and countered. Hypersonic glide vehicles change that equation. They can move horizontally and vertically within the atmosphere, altering course and making interception dramatically more difficult. That unpredictability is the entire point. By 2028, these systems are expected to be spread across multiple regions of Japan, turning the country into something far more difficult for any adversary to pressure or outmaneuver from afar. Then there is the Tomahawk factor. US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles are also moving into Japan's inventory, and that adds another massive leap in strike capacity. With a range of roughly 1,600 kilometers, The Tomahawk dramatically expands Tokyo's ability to hold distant targets at risk. The JS Chokai destroyer, expected to become one of the first Japanese Tomahawk carriers, has already been sent to the United States for modification. In just a few years, Japan's strike range is moving from roughly 200 kilometers to 1,000, and then to 1,600. That is an eightfold increase in range inside a country that for decades was defined by the limits of Article 9 and by a political culture deeply shaped by the legacy of World War II. This is not just rearmament. It is a historic shift in national posture. And Tokyo did not make this turn because it suddenly changed its identity on its own. It made the turn because the environment around it changed. A defense doctrine built for an older Pacific is no longer enough for the Pacific that now exists. China's naval growth, submarine presence, and expanding operational confidence have transformed the strategic map. And Japan clearly no longer believes that a purely reactive defense model can guarantee its security in that environment. That is why the changes underway in Tokyo feel so profound. The state once defined by military restraint is now rearming with long-range missiles, hypersonic systems, and autonomous strike networks designed not merely to survive pressure, but to shape the battlefield before pressure becomes invasion. Yet Japan is not moving alone. South Korea is undergoing its own strategic transformation, and that may prove just as important. For years, Seoul's security priorities were dominated almost entirely by North Korea. That focus made sense. The threat from Pyongyang was immediate, visible, and existential. But the strategic horizon in Seoul has widened. South Korea now sees China's expanding naval reach, its pressure on surrounding waters, and the broader risks emerging in the East China Sea and Yellow Sea. In that context, the old idea that South Korea could focus almost exclusively on North Korea is breaking down. The region is changing, and Seoul is adapting with it. That adaptation has included a remarkable thaw in security coordination with Japan. Historical grievances, wartime memory, territorial disputes, and years of political mistrust have long kept the two countries from reaching anything like full strategic alignment. But pressure has a way of redrawing priorities. On April 8, 2026, Japanese Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi and his South Korean counterpart held a key meeting in which North Korean missile activity was officially the immediate focus. But the center of gravity of the talks quickly moved to larger questions: integrated defense against shared missile threats, co-development of AI-supported systems, deepening trilateral cooperation with the United States, and the resumption of joint naval exercises that had been suspended since 2017. That is not a routine diplomatic development. That is the slow dismantling of a 9-year freeze under pressure from a new strategic reality. History is full of moments when former rivals are forced into alignment by a larger danger. That may now be happening in Northeast Asia. What years of diplomacy and symbolism struggled to achieve, Beijing's military pressure may be accelerating through sheer necessity. Japan and South Korea are beginning to move not because they suddenly trust each other fully, but because they increasingly understand that the cost of not moving together may be far greater. That shift is now becoming practical, not just political. One of the clearest areas of cooperation is in autonomous warfare and artificial intelligence. Joint development in AI-supported systems, unmanned platforms, missile integration, personnel exchanges, and naval coordination is now moving from theory to policy. South Korea's industrial depth makes it a critical partner in that effort. Seoul brings serious strength in semiconductors, software integration, defense manufacturing, and advanced engineering. Combined with Japan's robotics, precision manufacturing, and systems architecture, the two countries together form a technological base that is far stronger than either acting fully alone. And they are turning that technological base toward a very specific problem: the cost imbalance of modern asymmetric warfare. China has increasingly relied on low-cost pressure tactics that force Japan and its partners into expensive responses. One statistic illustrates the problem well. According to former Japanese Defense Minister Jin Nakatani, in just the last 9 months of 2025, Japan scrambled fighter jets 304 times to shadow approaching Chinese aircraft, including more than 30 drone-related incidents. In many cases, two 15 fighters are launched to respond, and a single scramble can cost millions of yen. By contrast, the Chinese side can create pressure with much cheaper unmanned systems operating at a tiny fraction of the response cost. This is a war of attrition without shots being fired, one in which the defender slowly drains money, airframe life, and readiness while the challenger watches the bill rise. The only real answer to that is to reverse the economics. And that is exactly what Japan is now trying to do through its new autonomous coastal defense concept known as SHIELD, short for Synchronized, Hybrid, Integrated, and Enhanced Littoral Defense. SHIELD is one of the most significant military ideas now emerging in the Pacific. Officially announced by the Japanese Ministry of Defense, it is a layered architecture built around aerial, surface, and underwater unmanned systems designed specifically for Japan's geography and for the kinds of challenges China poses. Tokyo has allocated roughly $640 million from the 2026 budget for the project, with a much larger 5-year path that could raise spending on unmanned systems from around $630 million to approximately $6.3 billion, a tenfold increase. This is not a side project. It is becoming one of the core pillars of Japan's next-generation defense posture. The logic behind SHIELD is brutally practical. It is about turning China's own saturation logic back against it. Cheap autonomous systems can be used to overwhelm and exhaust expensive enemy defenses. Instead of spending a fortune on every reaction, Japan wants to create a battlefield in which its own lower-cost systems degrade and saturate China's higher-end defenses. That logic has already been proven in other wars. A relatively cheap one-way drone can force an adversary to spend enormous sums in interceptor missiles or radar effort to stop it. If 30 drones can be built for the price of one high-end missile, then the economy of air and missile warfare changes dramatically. What matters is no longer just range or speed. What matters is how efficiently each side can impose cost on the other. The Ryukyu Island chain near Taiwan has been chosen as the first major deployment zone for this concept. That choice matters enormously. In a Taiwan contingency, these islands become part of the frontline geometry of deterrence. Japan is effectively trying to turn its southwestern islands into an autonomous defense wall, one that can launch reconnaissance drones, strike drones, underwater systems, and layered responses in a crisis. In SHIELD's integrated strike concept, swarms of unmanned systems would move first to weaken an adversary's air defense and radar picture, and then larger missile attacks would exploit the openings created by the swarm. In other words, cheap autonomous mass becomes the key that unlocks the path for more expensive precision weapons. This is exactly why South Korea matters so much to the larger picture. Seoul is also accelerating its own movement into AI-supported and autonomous systems. It understands the same cost problem. It understands that the future battlefield in East Asia will not be won by expensive legacy platforms alone. It will depend on software, speed of adaptation, secure communications, anti-jamming capabilities, mass production of unmanned systems, and the ability to fuse sensors and strike networks in real time. South Korean defense giants such as Hanwha and Korea Aerospace Industries already have substantial experience in missiles, drones, and systems manufacturing. When paired with Japanese firms like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Kawasaki, the result is a combined industrial and technological weight that is difficult to ignore. Both countries are also learning from the same wars. Ukraine, in particular, has shown how cheap drones, layered autonomy, and fast production cycles can erode larger, more expensive systems. The Middle East has shown similar lessons in different forms. The old assumption that the best military is simply the one with the most exquisite and expensive hardware is no longer enough. Mass matters. Adaptability matters. Software matters. Production speed matters. Japan and South Korea are increasingly building around that truth. Of course, none of this is possible without money and political will. And here too, the transformation is striking. On April 7th, 2026, Japan's upper house approved what became the largest defense budget in the country's history, around $58 billion. That is the highest defense spending level since World War II. The broader national budget reached around $768 billion, also a record. Prime Minister Takaichi's political rise has been central to this shift. After her major election victory in February 2026, she moved quickly to signal that Japan's defense policy needed fundamental revision. She had already argued that the lessons of Ukraine demanded a serious rethink of national security and preparation for new forms of warfare driven by autonomy and advanced strike systems. Now those ideas are being translated into institutions, funding, and force structure. One of the clearest signs of this is the creation of a new branch within the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force dedicated entirely to unmanned systems and AI. That branch is expected to include subunits focused specifically on drone operations and AI-enabled battlefield automation. This matters because Japan faces a manpower challenge. Personnel sufficiency in the self-defense forces had reportedly dropped to just over 89% by the end of 2024. Unmanned systems offer one of the fastest ways to compensate for that shortfall. If autonomous systems can extend surveillance, logistics, strike, and support functions without the same personnel burden, then they become not just technologically desirable, but institutionally necessary. South Korea is making parallel investments. Joint missile defense, AI cooperation, personnel exchange, and network integration are all becoming more serious and more structured. This is not just about two countries buying more weapons. It is about them building a common architecture. And that architecture increasingly links not only Tokyo and Seoul, but also Washington. This is another reason the transformation is so significant. Japan's new systems are not being designed to operate in isolation. They are being developed for integration into allied command networks, intelligence systems, targeting chains, and shared operational pictures. That means the United States remains central, both politically and technologically. Japanese Defense Minister Koizumi's meetings in Hawaii, California, and Washington with companies like Palantir, satellite firm Hawkeye 360, and other defense technology players show that Tokyo is actively trying to plug into global networks of innovation, not just national production. His meeting with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in January further underlined the goal of speeding up defense industry cooperation. The future of SHIELD and of the broader Japan-South Korea transformation depends not only on missiles and drones themselves, but on the connective tissue behind them: software, secure links, satellite tracking, anti-jamming navigation, real-time data flow, and the industrial supply chains that make all of that scalable. This is why China's position is becoming more complicated than it may have expected. Beijing can no longer assume it is pressuring fragmented opponents one at a time. It is now facing an emerging regional defense network. Both Tokyo and Seoul are moving in the same direction at the same time, under the same pressure. They are not identical in doctrine or capability, and their political relationship is still not simple. But the trajectory is unmistakable. China's rise in military pressure is driving alignment among states that had long struggled to align. And that may be the greatest strategic failure in Beijing's current Pacific approach. A strategy meant to intimidate has become one that mobilizes. A pressure campaign meant to fracture the region has instead encouraged greater integration. A plan to dominate the sea and the sky has triggered the construction of a defense wall below, above, and across both. That does not mean China is suddenly contained. Far from it. Beijing still retains enormous industrial depth, naval power, missile capacity, and geographic advantages. It still has the ability to pressure Taiwan, challenge Japan, complicate American planning, and keep every neighboring state on edge. But the environment it faces is changing faster than many in Beijing may have wanted. Japan is rearming at a historic pace. South Korea is rethinking the direction of its military future. Joint planning is growing. AI-centered warfare is moving from conference language to procurement and deployment. Autonomous saturation strategies are being adopted to reverse cost imbalances. Long-range strike systems are multiplying. And the political taboo around much deeper military integration in Northeast Asia is eroding. That is why the Pacific now feels different. On the surface, it still looks calm. Shipping moves. Air patrols continue. Exercises come and go. But beneath that apparent calm, something much larger is happening. The old strategic assumptions are breaking. Japan is no longer just a shield. South Korea is no longer looking in only one direction. The island chains, airspaces, and surrounding seas are being turned into nodes of a wider architecture that is designed not merely to endure Chinese pressure, but to impose serious costs on China if pressure turns into something more dangerous. Nothing about this transformation guarantees peace. In fact, it could make the region more tense in the short term. More missiles, more drones, more autonomous systems, more integrated defenses, and more strategic coordination can all intensify the sense of competition. China may respond by accelerating its own buildup even further. That could deepen the arms race many already fear. But for Tokyo and Seoul, the alternative now seems more dangerous still. If they do not move quickly, adapt deeply, and coordinate more seriously, then they risk facing a future in which the balance of power shifts too far, too fast, and too permanently. That is the real significance of what is happening now. This is not just another cycle of military modernization. It is a structural shift in the Pacific power map. The countdown has already begun. The waters may still look calm from a distance, but underneath them, the deepest strategic boil in decades is already underway. China wanted a quieter Pacific, one it could shape from a position of expanding dominance. Instead, it may have awakened a regional counterforce stronger, smarter, and more unified than at any point in recent memory. And if that trend continues over the next 2 to 3 years, then Beijing may discover that the biggest threat to its Pacific ambitions was never one rival acting alone. It was the moment its own pressure forced its rivals to start acting together,